Allen Lund Company has new offices in Ogden, Utah and Indianapolis, Indiana. Check allenlund.com to reach them.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Redding.
A case involving a truck driver, CBD, a failed drug test, and a firing has reached the U.S. Supreme Court. Paul Torlina, OOIDA's advocacy counsel, breaks down the case, which is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of using unregulated products as a truck driver. Also on today's program, what makes someone a safe driver? And who are the safest truck drivers? Different organizations, different truckers, and different advocacy groups have all thrown out their ideas of who those drivers are. But a recent study by two researchers at Auburn University indicates that women are the safest truck drivers. I'll talk with them about their research, their definition of safety, and why they think women are the safest drivers. But first, the news with Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has announced decisions on two separate hours of service exemption requests. First, the agency announcing the renewal of an exemption for the package company Westrock. It's for certain short-haul drivers at a paper mill in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Since the shipping and receiving departments are located on opposite sides of the mill, truck drivers are required to travel on a public road to transport trailers. That happens an average of 40 times a day. And while the drive is just about 275 feet, it is considered interstate travel due to the fact that the cargo being transported is either going to or coming from other states. Westrock has been operating under the same exemption for more than a decade now. FMCSA determined that extending the waiver will not compromise safety. The extension runs through early 2029. Meanwhile, FMCSA has reopened the comment period on a previous application from McKee Foods Transportation. The Tennessee-based trucking company is asking for a 5-year extension to an hours of service exemption. That's related to team driving and sleeper berth time. McKee has been working under that exemption for more than 4 years now. It allows team drivers at McKee to take the equivalent of 10 consecutive hours off duty by splitting sleeper berth time into 2 periods totaling 10 hours, provided neither of the 2 periods is less than 3 hours. Once a notice is published in the Federal Register on Tuesday, the public will have 30 days to comment. Federal regulators have begun to investigate Tesla's full self-driving feature, which allows the vehicle to take control of driving functions in limited conditions. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration probe was prompted by 4 crashes, all of which happened within the past year. NHTSA will specifically look into the full self-driving feature's ability to respond to reduced roadway visibility conditions, including sun glare, fog, and airborne dust. Crash report data show that cloudy conditions were present in 2 of the crashes and a dust storm in another. All but 1 occurred on a highway, and 2 of the Tesla cars crashed into a stopped vehicle. The full self-driving feature started being offered in model year 2016 Tesla cars. The NHTSA investigation could affect more than 2.4 million vehicles. A bill with implications for truck drivers that was introduced more than a year ago continues to gain support. 3 more lawmakers have signed on to H.R. 4963, the Tax Fairness for Workers Act, over the past week. That brings the total number of co-sponsors now to 203. For truck drivers, a bipartisan bill would return the right of company truck drivers to utilize a per diem tax deduction. OOIDA is on the list of supporters. In support of a previous version of the bill, Association President Todd Spencer wrote that the elimination of the per diem for company drivers has, quote, unfortunately increased the tax exposure for many hardworking Americans who make their living behind the wheel of a truck, end quote. A Senate version of the bill introduced by Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania has 40 co-sponsors. You can learn more about the Tax Fairness for Workers Act with details for contacting your lawmaker at fightingfortruckers.com. The Environmental Protection Agency has awarded $125 million to dozens of projects meant to help with the transition of zero direct emission technologies. The Diesel Emissions Reduction Act National Grants Program prioritizes projects in areas that have air quality problems. The EPA says more than half of the projects selected for this round of funding include replacing older equipment and vehicles with zero-emission technologies, such as all-electric school buses, terminal tractors, drayage trucks, and more. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration is taking a look at how states collect crash data. The agency is trying to determine whether the lack of uniformity between states affects the quality of the crash data coming in. For instance, some jurisdictions have stopped collecting data on crashes that only involve property damage to save law enforcement time and resources. Others have stopped sending sworn officers to respond to those types of crashes altogether. NHTSA has opened up a comment period that runs through December 16th. The notice includes a list of questions that NHTSA would like answered. The Virginia DOT is getting some much-needed money to help with recovery efforts post-Hurricane Helene. The Federal Highway Administration has released $10 million in relief for the state. The money will go toward emergency repairs to key transportation networks and routes. One project at the top of the list, reopening Route 58 near Damascus. The road was washed away due to flooding, forcing authorities to set up a 30-mile detour. It's just the latest round of relief coming from the Federal Highway Administration for areas affected by Helene. That includes $100 million for North Carolina and some $32 million for Tennessee. The National Park Service continues to remind truck drivers to stay off a rural highway between Tennessee and North Carolina. With the closures of both Interstates 40 and 26, some motorists have been trying to use US 441 as a detour, but officials are turning them away. US 441 is a two-lane road with steep continuous grades and tight curves and is not designed for heavy trucks. Signs have also gone up warning truckers of the restrictions. Those caught ignoring those warnings will be issued a citation, which could include a fine of up to $5,000. Electric vehicle users in Vermont will soon get hit with a bigger bill. In addition to the regular registration fee, electric vehicle users will also be charged an infrastructure fee. For plug-in hybrid vehicles, a fee for 1 year is $44.50 or $81.50 for 2 years. Battery electric vehicle owners will be charged $89 for 1 year or $163 for 2. NBC5 spoke with Vermont State Senator Thomas Chittenden, who is on the Transportation Committee in the legislature. He says a user fee is fair given the fact that the state does not collect gas revenue from electric vehicle owners.
This is one of the very few fees I know of that the governor did not veto. And I think it's because the rationale is that this is justifiable. The more you use the roads, the more you pay at the pumps, which the more that money gets redirected into our roadways.
That fee will start being collected starting on January 1st. Nearly $5 million is going toward improvements for West Virginia's roadside weather stations. The stations across the state collect data on weather and road conditions, then transmit that information to the West Virginia DOT's Traffic Management Center. According to officials, these stations will allow the state DOT to alert drivers to adverse road conditions in real time, which will enhance road safety. And finally, 4 more people are being inducted into the American Trucking and Industry Leader Hall of Fame this week. The American Truck Historical Society will recognize Robert Young of ABF, John Ruan of Ruan Transportation, Marvin Rush of Rush Enterprises, and Frederick McKinley Jones of Thermo King during an induction ceremony on Wednesday in Kansas City, Missouri. The American Trucking and Industry Leader Hall of Fame honors individuals whose contributions have had a lasting impact on the transportation industry. That's Lane Line Now News for today. I'm Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Scott. OOIDA is teaming up with Wreaths Across America to help honor U.S. military veterans. OOIDA will offer the chance to sponsor a wreath for $17. For each wreath sponsored, $5 goes toward the association's annual Truckers for Troops campaign, which benefits veteran organizations and sends care packages to active military personnel stationed overseas. We'll have a direct link to where you can sponsor a wreath at landlinenow.com. Starting November 1st, Marty Ellis and OOIDA's tour truck, The Spirit of the American Trucker, will be at the Louisiana Truck Show. That takes place at the Rain Civic Center and Pavilion in Rain, Louisiana. Stop in, say hi to Marty, and join OOIDA for a $10 discount. Do you have a news tip? Maybe you have a comment about something you heard on the air. Email us at landlinenow@ooida.com. Next, Scott Thompson discusses a court case involving CBD and a failed drug test with OOIDA's Paul Torlina, and we'll cover research from Auburn University on safe truck drivers. I'm Mark Rettig, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
Control your toll costs and eliminate tolling headaches with Prepass Tolls. Prepass Tolls means toll volume discounts. Just one invoice for all tolls and fewer violations. Call 877-878-5970 or go to prepass.com.
Are you tired of the IRS following you around like a dark cloud? Call 888-557-4020 and get your life back.
At Truck Stop, we built a better load board for carriers like you. Sign up today and access over 600,000 loads on the most trusted online load board. Learn why the best in the business rely on Truck Stop to make more money and start driving your profit today.
It's tested and proven. Burn 2.1% less fuel when you balance all wheel ends with Centromatic. Call 800-523-8473 to get the OOIDA discount.
Welcome back to Landline Now. The trucking industry is full of cautionary tales, and we were just reminded of another one thanks to a case that the Supreme Court has just taken up. It involves a truck driver, CBD oil, and 12 years of court battles. And joining us to discuss is Paul Torlina. Paul is advocacy counsel for OOIDA. Paul, how you doing?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to go all the way back to 2012 here for the start of this. We've got Douglas Horn, a truck driver of about, I think, 14 years, he had said. He was thumbing through a magazine, came across an ad for a CBD product called Dixie X. Thought it might help him with some pain he was having. He said he called the company, did some research, and was told and found out there was no THC in that product. He took it. Come to find out, surprise, surprise, there was THC in it. He failed a drug test, and Paul, that's kind of when things unraveled here. He got fired, and that set off kind of this whole process that we're looking at now in terms of the Supreme Court, right?
Yeah, and just to maybe throw another fact in there, as far as the positive test goes, he says that he was using the product. He tested positive and figured, well, heck, it had to be the product. There's nothing else it could have been. So he ordered another jar of the product and sent it out for testing, which is how it allegedly became known that it had THC in it. However, one kind of gap in this case that we don't know the answer to is whether he used any other substances between the time that he used the CBD cream and got the second one tested, which I think as part of what we're talking about today is a highly questionable chain of events that you're trying to prove in court. Something you always have to keep in mind if you're going to rely on the legal system to kind of get you out of a mess that you could have avoided is that there are always a lot of variables involved in these cases, and they can be minefields.
Well, that raises a big question, I think, then, too, right? I imagine Mr. Horn was not the only one who ran a test on this CBD product, right? I mean,
I would like to think so if they got this far in the litigation, but I think what kind of saved him in this case is the fact that there was THC in the second sample,
right,
to where anybody who wanted to argue, well, we don't know whether you used THC 2 days afterwards or not, it's probably a red herring. It's probably an argument that didn't really matter for purposes of this case that we'll get into in here in a little bit.
Yeah. And again, we're going to talk about the cautionary tale and all of this because I think this is a very good reminder for folks out there who are professional truck drivers about CBD oil, about any other number of products that you see out there at truck stop, right in front of the cash register, which we're going to talk about for sure. But this case in particular is interesting because it's gone through the entire process over the past 12 years. It is now at the Supreme Court. And we've got the arguments here, which I think are interesting. What is the truck driver's argument here? What is he trying to state that this company responsible for the CBD product did in terms of harming him, right? That's what we're talking about.
That's what we're talking about. So just not without getting too deep in the weeds on legal theories, but in general, if you have a case against a manufacturer of a product and you want to make what's called a product liability case for harming you, you're typically limited to only personal injuries that happen to you. For example, if you use a cream and it burns your skin or somehow sends you into a psychedelic state because it has THC in it, those are personal injuries. In this particular case, he's alleging that his injury is that he tested positive for THC in his system and was subsequently fired and lost his business and income opportunities. So that's a products liability case in the traditional sense. So he knew he couldn't prove that case because he had economic injuries here to his business and to his employment. So he brought a RICO civil case. And a RICO is the Racketeering, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act.
Usually mobsters.
Usually
mafia,
criminal, yeah. And so, but there is a civil component of RICO that allows you to bring a case against an entity acting not in a criminal way, but in a way that harms you and causes you civil damages, such as economic damages. And there's a specific part of this that says civil damages will lie if you have injury to your business or property under RICO. So what this gentleman alleged was, nothing really happened to me personally. I wasn't injured. I didn't have any issues with the actual product hurting me physically, but it cost me my job and my business. And that's what this case is about. So he had to kind of take that exception in RICO. And then RICO civil liability creates what's called a chain of proximate causation test that has to happen. So what this gentleman, Mr. Horn, had to do was set up a whole link of things that happened that caused this. And so his main allegation is that this company knew that there was THC in their product, CBD product, but they continued to repeatedly put it into the market and say, oh no, THC free, drink the snake oil, drink the tonic, and this stuff will help you feel better, but you'll never test positive because there's no THC in it. So that is a big component of a RICO claim, is that you have to have a repeated, what's called a predicate act, or a act that causes harm. And that's what sets up the racketeering portion, or the kind of, like you said earlier, it's like a mobster, a crime kind of
organized crime,
kind of behavior, but it's civil. It's not an actual criminal act. So that's what his claim is here, is that these companies knew, but just covered it up and said, we're just going to keep doing it and advertising it as CBD only and THC free.
I am not an attorney. You are. To me, this strikes me as, and we don't want to get too far in the weeds here. I understand that, but this strikes me as a kind of case that should be kind of open and shut, because you've got a company claiming one thing that is proven to be false. It did affect somebody in a negative way. I guess we don't have to second guess his attorneys here, but would there have been a different course of action to take that wouldn't have been, this complicated, or was there a reason that they went this route, this RICO route, as opposed to something else?
Well, I think RICO was the only thing they had to hang their hat on.
That was it, okay.
Because as I was describing earlier, with a typical products liability claim, you got to have some personal injury.
Right.
And typical state law products liability claims do not allow for any recovery of economic damages. So it limits you to, I had to go, I had to see a skin doctor to get these burns that this cream gave me cured, or I had to be put in a mental institution for the psychedelic state that this put me in that I couldn't recover from. Something personal that required treatment or recovery. That's what products liability actions are aimed at. But if your damages are only economic, you lost money, you lost a business deal, you lost your job or whatever, typically products liability cases don't allow for that type of recovery. So that's why RICO gets involved here, is because there's this, you have to have the repeated predicate act, but that's what these attorneys thought they had here, was a repetitive sale of a product under false pretenses that caused this business or property harm that a RICO civil claim does allow you to recover for.
I think just based on the way you kind of laid that out, it becomes clear as to why this has gotten to the Supreme Court, because they're trying to apply, one thing to something where it hasn't been applied before, and the Supreme Court probably looks at those cases and kind of, wrings their hands a little bit and thinking, oh, we can take a look at this and see if it leads to something new here. The Supreme Court is looking at this. They heard oral arguments recently, right?
Yes.
I know we're not going to get any kind of decision until probably next year, or most likely next year.
Correct.
I'm curious, because we do know how the justices ask questions, or line of questioning, maybe which way they might be leaning in terms of this case. What did you take away from what you've seen, from what the justices were asking, the two sides here?
Well, it's interesting, because when you read some of the commentary, you'll read one commentary that says, well, the way they ask these questions, he's definitely going to win. And then you read another one that says, well, maybe not so fast. So you kind of have to drill down on what exactly they were asking. And one thing that I found particularly interesting was Justice Alito, who's typically known as a pretty conservative right-side justice who would not favor a person in the labor industry who would maybe favor commerce and maybe favor this company. He specifically was asking, if you're putting this product out there and you know it's got THC in it, isn't this a foreseeable result? Is that someone's going to test positive and possibly lose their job or lose a business deal, which is very non-Alito to ask.
But a very common sense question, yeah.
Yes, it is. And on the flip side, Justice Thomas, who's also very conservative, essentially made the statement during questioning, hey, this medical marijuana company didn't fire you. It was someone else who made the decision to fire you. That breaks the chain of causation here. You know, you have this chain of causation up to the point where it was actually your employer who fired you. They made the decision, not this medical marijuana, which is a pretty nuanced point to make. But in his thinking, there is a link in the chain that has been broken because medical marijuana is the name of the company that manufactured this and distributed it as Dixie X or whatever variations they had.
Right.
But what Clarence Thomas's point is, I'm looking at this chain, but eventually we get to the chain where your company didn't have to fire you. They could have suspended you. They could have disciplined you. They could have something else to you besides firing you.
Right.
You're the one who got yourself fired in this situation, which is it's pretty out there. But
that's some tough love right there.
It is. And that makes me wonder if there's going to be a sentiment in the Supreme Court where they're going to say, look, we recognize, and just this is a quick sidebar, but it kind of explains how we got here. There's a split in the appellate circuits at the federal level. Some of the circuits say this is a good case. Some of the circuits say this case should be dismissed and go nowhere. That's why the Supreme Court's hearing this case is to kind of try to resolve that split and bring all of the circuits in the country in federal court under one standard here. So that's why they're hearing the case. What makes me wonder if they're going to kind of say, look, we're going to punt. We don't want to rock the boat on what's been going on for a while, is a comment like Justice Thomas saying, look, this might all be true, but the chain doesn't make it all the way to you getting fired by your company. There's a broken link there because the company didn't have to take that action. They could have done other things. Facts could have gone a different way to where your harm never actually happened. The termination and the lost income never happened. The company could have done something else. So the company is the one taking the action here, not the bad product. That's essentially what his point is.
Right. But I would look at that and say the company made that decision based on the decision of deception, seemingly, from that other company that led this guy. I see what Justice Thomas is saying there, but I see a direct link. But who knows? I mean, obviously they are much better legal minds than I am, for sure. I do want to make sure we talk about the cautionary tale of this. Yes,
absolutely.
Right? Because as any of our listeners know, and as you know, THC as a professional truck driver with a CDL, you can't have it. You can't have it in your system.
Zero tolerance.
The issue with this is that this guy seemingly did everything right. He looked into it. He was told by the company that there was no THC. He thought he was doing everything the right way, and obviously it turned out not so great for him. And 12 years later, we're in a legal battle. The cautionary tale here is be incredibly careful about what you're using, especially even at truck stop, like we were talking about. Truck stops, the cash register, you see all those pills, you see this oil and that cream and whatnot.
Which are all unregulated, by the way.
Exactly, and that's the point. But you got to be super careful about all of that. And we talked with CMCI, and they essentially said the same thing, right?
Correct. They said just don't touch it, abstain from it. And just kind of my perspective on it is I would never advise a client, if I was out practicing in a law firm, I would never tell a client, do whatever you want, and then we'll just file a lawsuit to try to fix it later. This is the last place you want to find yourself.
Yeah, I can't imagine that this gentleman 12 years ago thought, hey, I'm going to take this, and 12 years later I'm going to be in the Supreme Court, with an attorney arguing a case. Right. You don't want to end up there. You don't want to end up, getting fired or falling in the bad graces of FMCSA for a failed drug test. It is very easy to fall into these traps, especially with these false promises that are out there about this pill or that cream or whatnot. But again, just be incredibly careful and make sure you're listening to your physician about these things in particular as well.
Right. The CBDs, the Kratoms, the herbal teas, all those kinds of things out there. Buyer beware.
Asking for trouble, for sure. Paul, we will keep an eye on this. We will update people once the Supreme Court gives us a decision to see where it all ends up. But an interesting case, and we appreciate you coming by and sharing your thoughts with us.
You bet.
That was Paul Torlina of OOIDA. Time now for a break. We're back right after this with more Landline Now.
Penske owns and operates some of the best-maintained vehicles on the planet. Our used trucks come with a 5-year maintenance report and pre-sale inspection. So if you're in the market for a top-quality pre-owned truck, look no further. Search our inventory today at PenskeUsedTrucks.com.
Capital Reman, the leader in remanufactured diesel engines and components, has partnered with OOIDA to offer exclusive member benefits. Visit CapitalReman.com today to support America's transportation industry and take advantage of your benefits.
When it's time to overhaul your truck engine, help protect it by insisting on a genuine Vibertech TVD crankshaft damper. Heavy-duty, absolute premium quality, and they're made right here in the USA. Find a dealer at VibertechTVD.com.
There's a long-standing debate in trucking, one in which many people have a strong opinion, and that is this: what makes someone a safe driver, and who are the safest drivers? You're listening to Landline Now, and I'm your host, Mark Reddick. Welcome back to the program. Many truckers have a basic definition of being a safe driver. It's no reportable accidents, those in which an injury takes place or in which one of the vehicles needs to be towed. It has to be that, and none in which the driver is at fault. Many safe driving awards use this definition when they honor a trucker for so many miles driven safely or so many years as a safe driver. Whatever your definition, it does leave open that other question: who are the safest drivers? Different organizations, different truckers, and different advocacy groups have all thrown out their ideas of who those drivers are, but a recent study by 2 researchers at Auburn University indicates that women are the safest drivers. Beth David-Sramick, chair of the Department of Supply Chain Management, and Dave Ketchen, a professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship, led the team that conducted the 12-year analysis. I spoke with them recently about their research, their definition of safety, and why they think, based on that research, that women are the safest drivers. What was the overall topic of your study?
So we were looking at the idea of operational safety compliance. So if you think about that broadly, a lot of industry contexts have safety compliance rules and regulations in place. And that's incredibly important for the safety of the employee, for consumers, for various stakeholders. So one of the questions that we had was, are women more likely to follow those compliance rules than men? So that was part of the interest. The other part of the interest for us, so I'm the department chair for the supply chain management at Auburn University, and we've got a Center for Supply Chain Innovation, and we have a lot of transportation companies, trucking companies in particular, that we work with, and a lot of our students get employed by trucking companies. So we thought, this would be a really great context to study operational safety and compliance, because we've got some industry experts that we can kind of check ourselves against.
Now, what led you to study specifically the difference between women and men?
This started, so we were at the University of Arkansas. There was a small group of us from many universities, and we started looking at the impact of regulation on how supply chains functioned. So we would meet as a group and discuss it. Many of us had trucking companies in our orbit. So one of the initial questions when we started talking was about the number of women truck drivers. And I just threw out the question and said, hey, do we know specifically how many women are in trucking? And that sort of launched into this first understanding what is the proportion of women in the industry, and then the questions kept rolling.
Well,
that's always what happens when you get a bunch of academics together. That's just always what happens. We're actually more interesting than you would think.
There you go. Well, Obviously, you had to gather a lot of data for this. It's a very broad topic, even when you get into the specifics of, say, women versus men. How did you gather that data? What were your sources? Where did you go?
That's a great question. And that was the biggest challenge that we had. So we eventually got it from the FMCSA, but we had to do a FOIA request because the FMCSA data is some of it's public, but we needed the gender piece. So were the truck drivers male or female? Well, they wouldn't give us names, which was understandable. So then we said, okay, well, how about one of our co-authors, he's our data scientist of the group, and he said, well, let me write some code, and we don't need the names. We can write some code, and it will give us the probability of whether that name is a male or female.
That code would toss out names like Chris or Pat that both men and women could use.
But you'd mentioned earlier you didn't have the names or they wouldn't give them. Did you get that through the FOIA request?
So the FOIA request allowed us to get the probability of whether that driver was male or female.
Okay. Let's get a little bit into what you found when you started going through this data. And I've seen some material from Auburn that says you found basically data that women are safer, but I'm wondering safer how? By what measure?
So we looked at two different safety variables or compliance variables. One was hours of service compliance, and then the other was driving violations. And driving violations that was pretty broad. It could be speeding, it could be traveling too close. So broad range of driving violations. So we looked at those two specifically. And then we looked at, is it a minor or a major violation? And the data, it's on a 1 to 10 scale in terms of how they rate it. So we just we broke it up into minor and major based on that scale.
Once you filtered through and went through those kind of parameters, what were some of the key differences you found between male and female drivers?
Overall, we found that women are more likely than men to follow HOS and driving compliance rules of the road. That was the overall finding. Now, it gets a little more nuanced than that, because one of the things that we looked at was, well, what was the impact of the ELD? So when the ELD was introduced, what we found was that monitoring device, and that was another interesting question. Well, how much does monitoring matter? If you monitor, then what we thought we would see happen is that gap between men and women would close, and that basically men would be less likely to break that rule once the monitoring went into effect. And we did find that.
And specifically what you're saying there is you found that the number of violations that were cited went down, right?
Yes. So overall it went down.
There's no way to know if they didn't get caught whether or not they violated the hours of service.
That's correct. So it was the number of violations. And more significantly, it's that men were not any more likely than women to violate the HOS rule.
I want to ask about something, and I think you had a caveat on this when we were emailing earlier. Did the number of accidents and or fatalities that truckers were involved in match the figures for compliance in those two areas you looked at?
That's a great question, and we did not capture accidents. The data that we had was just relative to whether there were violations that had been incurred.
Okay, so you don't have a figure on whether safety regulation violations went up and down with the number of accidents and or fatalities?
No. And one reason that we were hesitant to try to make that connection is when those accident numbers are reported, it doesn't give, or at least we couldn't find data that would tell us were the accidents the fault of the driver, of the truck driver. So if that information isn't available, then it's hard to parse out whether complying to a rule and accidents match up if you don't know who's at fault. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. I want to kind of ask you a devil's advocate question, kind of related to that. And this relates to an email exchange that we had earlier, where you mentioned the fact that your study doesn't include data on accidents, fatalities. And you said that you chose to focus on the violations because it was a better metric for safety. That said, when truckers talk about safety, it's usually in terms of, have I avoided having an accident or a fatality? That the safe driver is one who avoids those things. There's also research from the Government Accountability Office, and this was back in 2014, and it showed that of all the different regulations and violations, they could only find 2 of them that actually had a statistical correlation to crash risk. So all that said, is this really an indication of safety, or why did you think violations were a better indicator of that? How are you defining safety?
That's a great question. So when I said it's a better indicator or a better metric, it's because the accidents don't include fault. So that was my rationale for that. It wouldn't be if we can't tease that out statistically, then our results are not going to be valid or reliable. So that was purely from the way that we looked at the analysis. But I think to your point, there's whether it's keeping the rules or not violating the rules directly associates with less accidents. You would think that it would. You would think that, speeding is you're going to be more likely to be in an accident when speeding is involved. So I think there's logic for it, but it would just be hard to statistically tease that out.
Yeah, the types of relationships we're talking about are all else being equal type relationships. So we can't control for, say, the skill or the experience of the driver. So, a very skillful, experienced driver can, I would imagine, drive much faster without getting in an accident than a rookie driver that's, following the speed limit. And so, those kind of, and you think about hours of service as well. I mean, some people do better with less sleep than others. And so, we have no way to account for those things, especially the way the data were provided to us with the anonymity of the drivers.
You had mentioned speeding a moment ago, Beth, and I want to kind of go into that. The figure that the federal government has put out in the past, the category was speeding or driving too fast for conditions, which, when you kind of get into the nitty gritty, are really 2 different things. Objectively, there is a posted speed limit, you're above it or below it, versus an officer looking at things after the fact and saying, I think you were driving too fast for the conditions. And we actually talked with a researcher, Dr. Stephen Johnson, who at the time was at the University of Arkansas, who actually separated those out to an extent. Were you able to separate those out and find out how many of the 2 different types of violation within that category were, what the figures were for men versus women on those?
No. So the data that was provided was specifically we just looked at driving violation broadly, and it was either minor or major.
Gotcha.
So speeding was one of those, and probably the most obvious, the one that would come to mind. But the way that the data was presented, we didn't tease that out.
I've been talking with Beth David-Sramick, chair of the Department of Supply Chain Management, and David Ketchen, a professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship, both of Auburn University. And our topic is recent research by a team they led that indicated that women are the safest drivers. After a short break, we'll have more of that conversation. That includes a discussion of the differences in regulatory compliance and safety by smaller versus larger carriers, 2 years in which women had more hours of service violations than men, the role of the truck parking shortage in the issue, and more. We'll be back in just a moment with more news and information. Please stay with us through a short commercial break. I'm Mark Reddick, and you're listening to Landline Now.
If you're running ultra-low sulfur diesel in your vehicle, make sure you are prepared and protected all winter long with Howes Diesel Treat, the #1 anti-gel product in North America from the 100-plus-year trusted brand Howes Products.
Truckdown.com. Whenever you have a breakdown, you need Truckdown.com. 24/7 access to 40,000 verified heavy-duty repair vendors nationwide. Owner-operators need roadside speed. Truckdown.com.
Firestone tires are for more of everything, with more durability for more miles and more confidence in your fleet. Firestone's tested tires help fleets save with value where it matters most. Learn more at bridgestonenationalfleet.com/4moremiles.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com, because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
Landline Now, welcome back. Before the break, I was talking with Beth David-Sramick, Chair of the Department of Supply Chain Management, and Dave Ketchen, a professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship, both of Auburn University. And our topic is recent research by a team they led that indicated that women are the safest drivers. We now continue that conversation in progress. One of the things that we look at quite a bit because of our audience, and our audience is primarily owner-operators, individual truckers, or smaller motor carriers. Did you have a chance, or did they divide the stats in such a way that you could look at the difference between larger versus smaller carriers?
Yes.
What did you find out there?
So we found that smaller carriers were more likely to violate HOS rules and had more major driving violations.
That's interesting because when we look at the accident statistics, the smaller carriers actually have a better record of avoiding accidents or fatalities. Is there some chronic dissonance there, or is it just a matter that they're more experienced?
That's a great question. Our data would not tell us that. And it goes back to, it would be difficult. I think that'd be a fascinating study. I would love to find a way to look at that. Because I think you make a really great point. And maybe I would love to get your take on this, because that was one of the things that we talked about was, well, why are we seeing these differences? Why are the smaller versus the larger? Why are we seeing differences in those violations?
I want to kind of go to another thing. I noticed in the abstract for your study, you mentioned that women had more hours of service violations than men in 2 years, 21 and 22. First, how much more? I mean, was it a significant difference?
So it was for the small carriers. It goes back, and this is where it was different again. So the small carriers, there were more violations for women for hours of service rules. And that one surprised us. And this was relative to men. So let me be clear. So that one really surprised us. We did not expect to see that. So we went to the women in trucking and asked them, hey, can we get some feedback from stakeholders? Can we post this on social media and just throw out this question? We really want to understand this. And the feedback that we got was during that time period, parking was a huge issue. And you had that was when demand was surging coming out of COVID, and there simply weren't enough parking spots, legal parking spots available for the amount of trucks on the road. So then for women, it became a question of, well, which rule do I break? Right? Like, do I park illegally on the side of the road because I've run out of my hours of service time has lapsed, or do I keep driving? And I would imagine, as a woman, my brain would say, I'm going to keep driving. I would rather break that rule because I'm going to feel more safe in my truck driving than I am sitting on the side of a road.
You mentioned hours of service violations changed with the advent of electronic logging devices, or ELDs. I guess the question is, one of the things that we've seen is that since the advent of ELDs, that deaths and accidents involving trucks actually went up. I mean, is this a case where we have kind of a divergence between the compliance versus the typical metric of safety being avoiding accidents and fatalities? Or what do you think is at work there?
So that's a great question. And that's one that we, and this is just, I'm speculating because the data doesn't tell us this, but it does seem that when you've got the hours of service rules, that it creates an incentive to get to where you're going faster, right? Because I know I've got a limited amount of time. I know where my next drop off or pickup is, and I want to get there before my hours of service lapses. So creating that rule creates an incentive to speed. This is what's fascinating, I think, in when you start talking about regulations. It's all of the unintended consequences.
Yeah, and in fact, we've seen some research where they looked at that in addition to looking at, of course, speed limiters, which are common on some of the larger fleets. And a lot of the drivers who are speed limited basically said that they keep it at that limited speed, which ends up having them go faster than perhaps they should, say, in a construction zone or in an area where the speed limit has been reduced because of the pressure of that 14-hour clock of that 11-hour driving time.
And that was one of the questions that we asked one of the trucking companies that we're engaged with regularly. We were having that conversation, and I asked her the same thing about the speed limiters, and that was exactly what she said was, well, speed limiters are when you're on the highway and you want to keep somebody from driving 90 miles an hour, that works. But if you're in a 30 mile an hour school zone, then that speed limiter doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
So if you can't go faster on the highway, then again, there's almost a perverse incentive, right?
Yeah.
That I'm going to make up the time elsewhere. Unintended consequences.
Of course, the majority of accidents tend to occur below the various speeds at which the limiters are set. So they really are not having an effect there, as you say.
Well, and that one of the things in the article, we questioned the efficacy of using speed limiters for that reason.
You know, if we could emphasize one thing in this conversation, I think Beth hit it, which is unintended consequences. You know, the speed limiter thing, we have to keep in mind trucks are sharing the road with cars. And if you have trucks with speed limiters, and you're on a 2-lane interstate and there's a truck doing 65 passing a truck doing 64 on the right, you're going to have road rage like crazy in those cars behind it. And it leads people to do all sorts of unsafe things in terms of trying to swerve around and even going over on the shoulders. And so, you know, if I could just say one thing to policymakers, it would be think hard about these unintended consequences.
That's all the questions that I have. Is there anything else that either one of you wants to add?
You know, I would just add that the one thing that I think that academics bring to the table, and I know there are lots of questions about the value of academic research, and we live in our ivory towers, right? But I will say that in this case in particular, this is one of those times where a lot of times everybody has an agenda, right? And you see a lot of industry research, and there's always an agenda behind it. And the good thing about having academics look into issues like this is that we're independent. We're not aligned with the ATA or with the Owner Operators Association. There's not a hidden agenda. We're very skilled in doing rigorous analysis and getting access to data and asking and answering some really interesting questions without an agenda behind us. There's not a certain outcome that we're looking for.
Yeah, nobody paid us and we don't have any conflicts of interest.
That's right. That's right.
I've been talking with Beth David Sramick, Chair of the Department of Supply Chain Management, and Dave Ketchen, a professor in the Department of Management and Entrepreneurship, both of Auburn University. And our topic has been recent research by a team they led that indicated that women are the safest drivers. That's our program for today. We'll be back tomorrow with another program. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Mark Rettig, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
I'm a dad,
a son,
a husband,
wife,
I'm a writer,
photographer.
I farm.
I'm a veteran.
I love old cars, fishing,
my kids,
chrome,
and I am
a professional truck driver.
And together we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us!
Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit OOIDA.com.